Emma, thank you so much for being with us here at Grace this evening. I wonder if you could just help maybe give us a picture of what the growth in Christianity has been like in China over the last 100 years or so.
Yeah, well, I know you're unpacking the story of C.T. Studd, and we know probably all these sort of amazing missionaries that have gone before, Gladys Aylward, Eric Liddell, such a rich heritage there, particularly in China, reaching the lost. And it's just really interesting that probably for many of those people, they didn't see the fruit in their lifetime. That's perhaps an encouragement for us as well, as we seek and serve right where we are. And I know in China, if you go back to the turn of the 20th century, there was probably around 100,000 Protestant Christians in China. And then, as we know, Christians or the movement of foreign missions very much was still part of the culture in China for many, many years after that. It wasn't really until I think sort of the 1920s, where particularly as the Communist Party rose to power and influence, you sort of see many sort of missionaries leaving. And then finally, in the early 1950s, as in 1949, the People's Republic of China was born. You see the sort of the final exodus of foreign missionaries from China. And at that point, in about 1949, I believe it's estimated that there are about 800,000 Christians in China. And then obviously it's interesting to map, really, isn't it, that from 1949 you have communist rule. Chairman Mao is ruling as a dictator and really has a goal of exterminating, eradicating the church. He described religion as poison. But I think something we look at a lot at Open Doors is that actually oftentimes persecution is a motive for the gospel. And so if you look at the history, the trajectory of growth of the church in China from that moment onwards, like in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, you have the Cultural Revolution. I think after Mao's death, it's estimated that there were 10 million Christians in China. It soon then doubled to 20 million. And now we estimate, and other sort of China watchers would estimate that there are something like 100 million Christians in China. And I was chatting to a friend of mine, part of the Open Doors team, who's a real expert in China, and he and many others like him predict that by 2030, there will be about 300 million Christians in China. And actually the world's largest Christian population will be in that country, which is quite remarkable, isn't it?
It's amazing, really, given such small beginnings. Are there ways in which Hudson Taylor, C.T. Studd, the China Inland Mission have left a legacy that is still felt today?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I find it quite encouraging, thinking that in some ways, you know, in God's way of working, they didn't fully see, did they, the impact, or live to see the full impact. And I was reminded, thinking of that, of Isaiah 55, verse 11, you know, which says, you know, my word goes from my mouth, but it will not return empty. It will not be void. It will accomplish what I desire. So that's a great encouragement, like I say, for us all, seeking to share the good news of Jesus around us, and your context there in Bedford. But I think there are two ways, particularly, that there is a legacy that's been left by Hudson Taylor, C.T. Studd, and the other sort of China Inland missionaries that followed. And the first would be this, that actually so many of the really big established churches in China today trace their heritage, their legacy. The reason they're there is because the likes of C.T. Studd, Hudson Taylor went, and other missionaries went and established churches in those communities. So yeah, the very big, large Protestant churches that you see in China today had their roots very much in the sort of the work that these guys did. A colleague of mine said he visited Wenzhou in China, and he walked into the large three-self church there in that city, which gathers hundreds of people every week. And he met the elders of the church, and they said this, that actually sort of a very unknown Scottish missionary had founded that church way back in 1868. Had very humble beginnings. It started really as a kids' club that he ran, and then became a church. And the elders of this particular church just look back with real gratitude and fondness at that particular missionary's story of sacrifice and cost. And let's be honest, faithful obedience to sharing the good news around the world. So that's one example. And I'm sure many other sort of churches in China today would have stories like that. And the second really is the current trend that we're seeing in missionary movements from China. So there's a a missionary movement in China amongst the house churches called Back to Jerusalem. And they are really passionate about going back to the countries where a lot of these missionaries came from. So it's good news maybe for us here in the United Kingdom that we're going to have Chinese missionaries come to us, because they want to almost like share their revival experience with the very places that took the gospel into China. So there are two examples there, I think, of legacy and incredible fruit as well.
It's stunning, really, isn't it? What God can do with people's efforts. Today, obviously, there's a lot of challenges facing the churches in China. What are some of those challenges that are facing them?
Yeah, so I mean, at Open Doors, we've been obviously working in China for a long time. We track sort of the trends of persecution and just the extent of how it's reaching, and we talk a lot about the sort of smash and the squeeze of persecution around the world. And maybe some of you know about our World Watch List, which ranks like the 50 most costly places to be a Christian. And this year we ranked China at number 17. So if you go back 3 years ago, China would have been ranked at number 43, which gives you an indication that actually things are getting a bit more serious and getting worse. And for the first time in over a decade, China is actually in the top 20 of this Open Doors World Watch List. And I was thinking of, if you guys really sum up what is going on in China presently against the church. And the first one is an S, suffocation. So we talk about squeeze, just life becoming a little bit tougher, the state regulation, state control, and very much linked to that S word, suffocation, is a word beginning with C, Chinification. What we're sort of seeing, and they're both like really interconnected. What we're seeing is just this idea of the Chinese Communist government is trying to make the church more Chinese, just bring that influence in. So you've got crazy things happening, like sort of pastors having their sermons sort of kind of regulated and monitored and read by local authorities around them. You've got pastors having to sing or encourage their congregations to sing the Chinese national anthem before a service begins. You've got things like the Chinese flag should fly higher than a cross outside a building, things like that. This just flexing their muscle, their control. Also, rather sort of ominously, there's a rule that's come into play over recent years where it's illegal for under 18s to attend church gatherings. Now, imagine that in your context. Tamar would be very much, and her team would be doing illegal activities. It would be very difficult for parents to, above the law at least, sort of send their children to church activities. And yet, obviously, this puts a lot of strain, a lot of pressure on what churches are doing. And increasingly, just in terms of their sort of whole digital monitoring, we're definitely seeing that sort of increase. And we know from what we just know more widely in the media that this is a real issue in China, isn't it? Sort of data and just the kind of monitoring, surveillance that is going on. So suffocation and Chinification is happening in the church in China. And that's obviously a very serious thing, because it is putting pressure on the Chinese house churches and the leaders and what they do and how they kind of act and maneuver and operate and do church under these kind of regulations.
So there's lots to pray for then. I mean, things to give thanks for, but also things to pray for. Could you give us just a few bullet points then as we finish to be thinking about and to be taking into the prayer life of our church corporately, but also individually?
Yeah, great. Well, I've got a little message really from Open Doors director for China, a lady called Peony, and she said this: I'm so grateful that you're praying for the church in China. And she says particularly, I ask that Christians everywhere pray for the faith of Chinese believers, that they would remain strong and bold. Pray that they would never give up, no matter how tough the persecution. Please pray especially for young believers. And I think in this context, she's thinking about young adults, young people, particularly this generation, have never really faced the extreme levels of persecution that perhaps their elders, their grandparents have had to live through. So this is a new sort of journey for some of these believers. But definitely what we're seeing is as the sort of house churches have to be innovative, be quite nimble and operate within sort of very strange, difficult times. There's this desperation to see the church grow. And, I think for sort of the leaders Open Doors work with, they very much have this sense, God has breathed new life into the church in China before. under difficult circumstances. And we believe that he would do it again. So I think our prayers should really sort of be that we will stand alongside, we'll pray that God will build his church. Just despite the gates of hell prevailing against it, nothing can stop the church of God growing around the world, and particularly the church in China.
Emma, thank you so much for spending this time with us and kind of giving us a window into what things are like now. I think you sent us a video, a particular message from a particular pastor there. So what we'll do is we'll close our service with that message, and then we'll be praying on for China. But thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure we'll see you back in Bedford before too long.